if you wish to do so. Before we begin, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Professor Hassan Bakshi, the director of the PEC, to introduce this research and this new phase in the Creative PEC's existence, and I will then hand over to him.
Thanks very much, Josh, and good afternoon, just past the midday, so good afternoon, everybody. As Josh says, I'm director of the Creative PEC. I'm just going to say a few words before I hand back to Josh for the presentation. Those of you that are familiar with our work will know that in the first 5 years of our life, with the ongoing support of the Arts and Humanities Research Council, which supports us, which funds us, we were charged with achieving a step change in the quantity and quality of the evidence base to inform the development of public policy in the UK's creative industries. Now, in this next phase of our work, where we've moved across to Newcastle University in partnership with the Royal Society of Arts, we want to further build the evidence base, in so doing addressing government strategic priorities set out in documents which many of you would have read, such as the UK Government Sector Vision, published earlier this year, as well as addressing the long-term structural issues, the challenges and opportunities facing the creative industries. Now, an important feature of our work in this next phase is that we are drawing a distinction between what we call regular quantitative data-rich set-piece state-of-the-nation publications, where we will track consistent sets of indicators, economic indicators primarily, over time, from research papers which focus more on primary research insights. The inspiration for this distinction is our observation that quite frequently the perceived lack of data and evidence is used as an excuse for policy inaction. Of course, there are major evidence gaps in many areas in the creative industries. However, in some key areas, we suggest, there is in fact now rather a lot of data. And it is in these areas where we have chosen to commit to publishing State of the Nations reports. And they are internationalisation of the creative industries. And by this, I mean foreign direct investment, international trade, migration, education, skills and talent, the arts, culture and heritage sectors, and last but not least, creative clusters, R&D and innovation. Creative clusters and place more generally is a fundamental research priority for the Creative PEC. It is hard-baked in our new structure, which follows a twin hub in the north of England at Newcastle University and in Westminster, London, at the RSA, where I'm joining the call. Another key feature I want to underscore is that we will produce State of the Nations in the plural sense. That is, the scope of our reports is intended to cover all of the nations and regions that make up the United Kingdom. So coming back to the report that we're launching today, with no further ado, let me hand you back to the lead author, Josh, to present the report's findings.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Hassan. I'm going to load our deck. Right, so today we've got we're launching this report, as we say, it's the State of the Nations. And in this particular report, we're talking about the geographies of creativity. And so this is the report. As we said, it's available to download on the Creative PEC website. And what we're trying to do in this report is we're trying to address a issue which has emerged for those of us who've been looking at the place-based agenda for understanding creative industries over the past few years, which is that when we talk about where creative industries operate and the levels at which they operate, we have become increasingly aware that creative industries operate on a number of different levels. And so a lot of the initial sort of key research that has taken place around identifying creative clusters, originally particularly that work done by Nesta, identified clusters often at the city or more technically at the commuting zone region, so places where people live and work in the same area. So this would be Manchester or Glasgow or Bristol or Cardiff, places like that, individual, but at the city level. And one of the insights that we brought in the previous iteration of the PEC through the Creative Radar reports that my team at Sussex and I wrote was to identify creative microclusters and saying, yes, there's something going on at the city level, but there are also really interesting pockets of activity, creative microclusters at the street level or the neighborhood level, or maybe at the rural town level. And these are also important for understanding where creative activity happens. Now, another activity which has also emerged in recent years is developments around the idea of a northern creative corridor. And this idea of creative corridors more broadly calls to the notion that it may be possible for discrete clusters to be linked up in an emergent way, and there may be emergent characteristics that can emerge from those. And drawing upon that work, what we are trying to do in this report is we're trying to, for the first time, really bring together all of these different levels and try to understand where they are and what's happening in these levels, to try to give some sense of context between them and to try to identify opportunities for policy intervention at the cluster level or the microcluster level, or potentially at the creative corridor level. Now, to begin, just to give a little bit of context in terms of where we're starting from on this. You can see the image on the screen shows total creative industries employment separated by devolved nation and region. And what this shows is that the creative industries remain very heavily concentrated in London and the southeast of England. Now, this is something which, if we look back to some previous PEC research that explored this a bit further, it found that there had been regional inequality that had been sort of narrowing up until the point of the financial crisis in the late 2000s. And after the financial crisis of the late 2000s, that gap began to widen. And our research and our report today finds that this gap is continuing to widen. And indeed, the evidence suggests that the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic did not necessarily see a narrowing of these gaps between regions. So there is a persistent level of regional inequality which we're seeing. And this is something which is important and worth trying to understand in more detail and trying to get a better grasp of from a policy perspective. So in our research, we begin by thinking about creative clusters, and think about clusters, again, identified at this sort of city or more technically commuting zone region. And on the screen, you can see 3 maps of the UK showing employment, labor productivity, and a proxy measure for GVA, gross value added. Now, what these maps show is, again, as we said, as we might be expected based on what I was just saying, there's a lot of activity that's going on in London and in the southeast. But what we also see is that there are real hubs and strengths and concentrations running all the way across the regions and the nations of the UK. One of the things that I found most interesting as we were getting stuck into the data from the report was that if we look at the sort of city regions that have the highest levels of employment growth over the period of 2017 to 2021, the top 3 were in the southeast, but the 4th was in Belfast. And the 4 nations of the UK were represented in the top 15 of the fastest growing areas in terms of jobs created. So there's a lot of activity going on across the regions. We can also see outside of London and the southeast, we can see a lot of activity and a lot of strengths in and across the north. We also see them in Scotland. So the high levels of estimated GVA for Edinburgh and Glasgow, and also strong activities in the Cardiff region. So this is something which is happening across the UK. And so part of what we're doing is trying to benchmark and understand what's going on in these areas. But from that, we then start to actually look and contextualize a little bit down into the creative microclusters. And the idea of creative microclusters, as set forth in some of our research that was originally published in 2020, where we identified 709 creative microclusters. Now, these microclusters are concentrations of 50 or more creative businesses or organizations that are proximate in a particular area, in a street, a neighborhood, in a town, something like this. And the map you can see on the screen shows where those are located. We have an online interactive map, which you can also look at on the original Creative Radar report website, where you can actually explore these in more detail. What we found in this research is, before we'd said, okay, we think they're important, but in this we've actually gone through and tried to look and quantify the economic importance of microclusters. And what we see is that these microclusters have grown substantially more than other areas. So inside creative microclusters, there's a lot of growth. And in fact, we find that nearly 3/4 of all new jobs created from 2019 to 2022 happened in creative microclusters. So there's a lot of creative industries, employment creation that's going on in these microclusters. And it really speaks to these as being real sort of growth hubs for the creative industries. Now, again, I'm flying through this report. The report, I think, is about 55, 60 pages. There's loads of kind of material in here, but we just want to give you a flavor of what's going on in this report, and in the hope that you'll find it to be interesting. Now, the last chapter of the report talks about the prospects for creative corridors. Now, what's this idea of corridors? And the idea of corridors comes from the notion that the benefits of clusters are not necessarily limited to a single city or a particular town, and that actually it's possible for clusters to span all the way across regions. Now, one of the sort of core insights that has driven some of the thinking around the idea of creative corridors, or sometimes called superclusters, it was an instance that emerged in Canada in the 2000s, when the city where the BlackBerry, the Canadian mobile phone manufacturer, was headquartered. It's about 100 kilometers away from Toronto. But instead of these two places working as places that were in direct competition, there emerged in this 100-kilometer area an innovation corridor, where with different companies on one side and lots of R&D intensive activities happening between them, which then serve to boost the entire area surrounding them. And the idea that's been proposed is that creative corridors may have a very similar role that they are able to play. The idea that these proximate areas with different clusters can become stronger through working, coordinating, collaborating, and building these up. Now, we suggest in this report that there is already one of these sort of superclusters in play in the UK, which is London M25 region, and there's a lot of activity there, and there's a lot of benefits that emerge from being in proximity to London. But what we're interested in this report is saying, are there possibilities that other corridors, other superclusters, can these be built? And to explore this in the report, we used a sophisticated spatial mapping algorithm to try to identify where there were spillovers of either employment or business concentrations, to try to identify where there are hotspots that are close enough that they could potentially be joined up to have the potential to be these corridors. And the maps that you see on screen show the results of this analysis. Now, it's fair to say, looking at this, it's possibly may be difficult to sort of understand all of the trends that we're seeing here, but to give some ideas of what we're looking at here, it's the red spots that we're particularly interested in. And what we can see from our analysis is there are a number of places outside of the sort of London and the immediate southeast where there are very strong clusters of activity. So we can see, for instance, that there's a grouping from Cardiff, Newport, Bristol, Bath. Those areas all together linking up in one corridor. We can see another chain of clusters going from Chester and Liverpool up to Manchester, all the way over to Leeds, and then possibly swinging all the way up to Newcastle. We see another set around the West Midlands, in the areas around sort of Birmingham and up and around the M40 area. We see other possibilities through Edinburgh, Glasgow, up to Dundee. We see other things showing up there. And what we suggest here is we say, this is a starter for 10. This isn't saying these things are absolutely here yet, but we're saying there's the possibilities for these things to exist. Now, to better understand the prospect for these, we then went into our some of the data that we previously collected through the Creative Radar analysis, going into some of the survey data that we've done. And we decided to do a case study on the Northern Creative Corridor. So if those of you who are listening to this may be familiar with the Northern Creative Corridor, which is trying to build up such one of these creative corridors across many of the combined authorities of the north of England. And we looked at what's going on in the north and tried to understand what's going on there to see if there's potential for these types of corridor activities. And our findings suggest that there is. We find that northern businesses have untapped potential for generating and strengthening supply chain linkages. We see that northern businesses are more likely to sell very broadly across the whole of the UK, but they're not particularly likely to actually sell to each other, to other places that are within the region. And we see opportunities to strengthen that in ways to build growth through there. We also find when we look at microclusters in the northern area, in the north of England, we see that a lot of the northern microclusters share similar characteristics to businesses in London, particularly in the London creative clusters. And we really note that particularly for northern microcluster businesses, the data suggests a very strong and important role for freelancers. Northern businesses and northern microclusters really value and rely on and use freelancers to strengthen their businesses a lot. And there's a really important role for freelancers in that ecosystem. We also find that northern microcluster businesses are particularly likely to view universities as being important to their activity. So we're identifying from the data a perception of a really important role for universities. And the other thing, and this comes back to some previous to findings which we've talked a lot about in the PEC before, we find that northern microcluster businesses are also more likely to perceive access to finance as a barrier to growth. We've talked about this in previously, but we highlighted again, there's an issue around access to finance for northern businesses, which is something which has begun to be addressed in some ways, but remains a persistent issue for these businesses. So this is a bit of a whistle-stop tour of the report. And again, I encourage you to download it and take a look and look at it in depth. But just to sort of summarize some of the key points, we see regional inequality has not particularly changed substantially post-pandemic. At the same time, creative clusters, they continue to produce an outsized contribution to the overall creative industry. So the large creative clusters in the UK still play a very dominant role in that space. We see creative microclusters are growth hotspots of the creative industries, but there are mixed indications about the impact of the pandemic on this. And I think some of that depends on where they were in terms of being within large clusters or possibly being outside large clusters. And finally, we discuss this issue of creative corridors and talking about the potential for creative corridors to strengthen individual clusters through collaboration. We talk about the way that these may emerge over time. Now, one of the important things to say, building on what Hassan said in his introduction, is this is the first. This is a starter for 10. This is the first of 5 State of the Nations reports that we're going to be writing on clusters over the next 5 years. And this is, in this particular case, we're using a lot of official data that's already existing, but we really want to improve. We want to help. We want to improve measurement within creative clusters, understand what's going on inside those clusters. We really need to understand the role of freelancers, and that's a really high priority for us. And we're also interested in looking at things like the impact of cultural infrastructure and investments on clusters and things like this. We welcome all thoughts and feedbacks about next steps or ideas or leads or sources of data, things to help get in a bit deeper to understand creative clusters. We're very interested in your thoughts on how we can develop this further. One other thing just to flag up, which is not available yet, but is going to be coming down the line fairly soon, is we're also building a lot of the data that we've been looking at here didn't have space to make it into a report without making it about 800 pages long, but we're looking to build an interactive map that will allow policymakers and anyone really to look at the performance of creative industries in individual areas and regions of the UK. We're going to be looking at that in more detail over the next couple of weeks or month, trying to get this online so you can actually look at this to have this be an ongoing resource from this piece. And finally, that's it. So thank you very much for your time. Thank you for listening. If you've got comments or questions, they're very welcome. You can reach out either to the PEC on social media or me personally. My email address is there. We welcome thoughts, ideas, comments. Thank you very, very much for listening. At this point, I'm going to go and hand over to my colleague, Bernard Hay, who's the Director of Policy for the PEC, and he's going to lead us into the discussion with our fantastic panelists. So thank you very much, and over to you, Bernard.
Thanks so much, Josh, for such a rich presentation. And I'm really pleased to be able to kind of introduce the next part of the event, which is to hear from our incredible lineup of panelists. So just a quick note on the format for the next sort of 30 minutes. So we're going to begin with some kind of 2-minute responses from our panelists, who I'm going to introduce in a moment. After that, we're then going to go into a kind of group discussion and then open for wider Q&A. So just to say, if you've got questions, please do start writing them down in the Q&A chat, which you can find at the bottom of your screen, and we'll hopefully be able to make time to answer those towards the next part of the session. So I think before we dive in and hear our responses, I think it's also just worth acknowledging that there's a wealth of quite technical language that sits around the idea of clusters, microclusters, creative corridors. But what I'm really hoping that we can do in the next sort of 30 minutes is to really get under the skin of the data, to look at what this means for creative places on the ground. And also with the incredible panelists we've got, I think it's also a real opportunity for us to think a little bit further about what are the implications for policy and industry action at different levels of administrative boundaries and geography as well. So to start us off, I'd like to introduce our first panelist, Lauren Lucas. Lauren is Advisor for Culture, Tourism and Sport at the Local Government Association, which is the national voice for local government in England. She's also a member of the English Public Libraries Stakeholder Working Group and coordinated the LGA's recent Commission on Culture and Local Government. So Lauren, I'll hand over to you.
Thanks very much, Bernard, and thank you for inviting me to join the panel here today. I mean, we really welcome this report, as well as the sort of ambitions of the Creative PEC to produce report on consistent indicators over time. I think this report builds on some of the Creative PEC's other excellent work in this area. I think from my perspective, what really sprang out at me was the way it demonstrates the real potential of those very geographically distributed microclusters as an engine of economic growth. And I was particularly struck by the finding that in 2022, 46% of all UK creative industries employment fell within one of those 709 creative microclusters, and that sort of positive connection between microclusters and employment growth. So I think that just shows there's so much potential for creative microclusters as part of that wider policy drive towards addressing regional inequalities. So I think three key points from me. So firstly, I think councils, as I would say, are crucial to this picture. The Commission on Culture and Local Government, on which Hassan very kindly served as Commissioner and published its report a year ago, highlighted that councils are the biggest public funder and operator of local cultural infrastructure, which I know this report highlights as being particularly important for microclusters as part of that cultural ecosystem. But councils are also place shapers. They are the only institution to have that democratic oversight over a local geographic area. They set the context in which the creative industries can grow through their role in planning, licensing, regen, and so on. And we've published a toolkit for councils on that topic, working with Gallant Innovation, which explores that. So firstly, councils are key. But secondly, I guess the proviso here is that local authorities are under huge financial strain at the moment. The LGA predicts there's a £4 billion gap in council finances by March 2025, and we're seeing a growing number of them having to serve Section 114 notices, so essentially saying they can't publish a balanced budget. If we really want to seize that potential highlighted in the report, a long-term sustainable finance settlement for local authorities. And thirdly, in the English context, I think there are huge opportunities still to be explored around devolution and development of combined authorities in supporting growth in the creative economy. We've published a report last year with BOP on that topic, and that picked up some of the examples of how people are already developing policy in this space. We're part of a wider project with Creative Commons looking into this over the next year, and we're commissioning a series of think pieces on culture and devolution moving forward. So that's probably enough from me as a starter, but we really welcome this analysis and look forward to the further reports in this series.
Great. Thanks so much, Lauren. And I think loads for us to unpack there in the Q&A and discussion as well. So I'd now like to introduce our second panelist, Saima Aslam. Saima is founder, CEO and artistic director of Bradford Literary Festival, which is one of the largest literary festivals in the UK and the largest diverse-led cultural organisation in the North. She's also a trustee and board member of the Peace Hall Trust, an Arts Council North member for Arts Council England, and an honorary fellow of the Royal Society of Literature, and also a Creative PEC industry champion as well. So Saima, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Bernard. I'm going to share a couple of reflections as well, both to the report and actually in terms of what Lauren was saying. I think it was really interesting to see the clusters that were appearing, and probably not unsurprising. I mean, that London M25 supercluster is absolutely no surprise. I think it is right to highlight the fact that we have these other potentials. But I think what we really need to think about is how do we actually enable that? Now, I'm going to pick up on the comment that Lauren was making around local authorities. We know that local authorities are really important to this. They have the overview in terms of their area, and they obviously hold the ambition at that level. We also know that that they are struggling at the moment. And I think this is, I think in terms of that long-term growth that we are talking about, this is something that actually needs to be really seriously addressed, because when people are firefighting, it's very difficult to have those long-term visions and strategies. I'm talking to you sat in Bradford, and we've been tremendously lucky. We have City of Culture coming up in 2025, and I know the amount of work and vision and strategy that was needed in order to make that happen. Susan Hinchcliffe, who's the leader of Bradford Council, Kirsten England, who's just stepped down as the chief executive. Now, they both came into position around about that 2014, 2015 mark, which was when the festival was setting up. So I've seen that journey in terms of the culture sector in Bradford, which is actually one of the traditionally underfunded areas, evolving and moving forward, and now gaining this accolade. And also very proud to have, for the festival to have played a part in that. So I think that's something that needs to be really, really seriously addressed. I think the devolved nations, I think that is an opportunity, but in order for that to be harnessed, the local level will have to be addressed. We will need to see a lot more cooperation in terms of the combined authorities. I think once we start moving outside London, the clusters actually become larger, because actually in order to have that effective harnessing, you're actually thinking about larger areas. And I think one of the things that I'd like to pick up on is the point about access to finance. And you mentioned the North in particular, and I was really interested, obviously, that in terms of North East, North West, Yorkshire and Humber, we're pretty much sat along the bottom. And I know that there has been so much work that has been done around this, but and talking from from my personal experience of running an organisation over the last 10 years, funding is hard to access in the North. I think the difference between the organisations that not only survive but thrive are the ones who can actually access that funding. If we want meaningful clusters, rather than actually just paying lip service to the fact that we want to be moving things beyond London, we are actually seriously going to have to think about what does funding and philanthropy look like in different areas. Because these are the things that the creative industries tend to rely on. Now, obviously, there is I'm talking about, there's the whole arts scene, and then there is the creative industries in terms of the more commercial end of it. But everything at the end of the day will be reliant on funding, and some of this goes back to sort of quite fundamental points that the PEC can't address, which is things like transport. I was having a conversation with somebody, which was literally about the fact that for somebody flying in to the UK from the States, our distances in terms of getting from, say, London to the north are tiny, because they are used to doing these massive journeys. But the hampering point for us is actually the transport infrastructure, which is something we need to come back to. And the very last point I'll make is there is an EDI angle to these things as well. You mentioned Arts Council England, and I know ACE have done a lot of work around diversity in the last run around the last funding round of the national portfolio organisations, and I know that the diversity makeup is uneven, but again, as a country, I think in terms of us thriving, appealing internationally, bringing that kind of investment in, that is something we really need to focus on. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you. And I think lots of really interesting themes there. From how do we kind of create the enabling conditions for that long-term vision, but also then implementation of long-term plans, specifics of geography, and I think yes, that finance question is absolutely key as well. So I'm going to hand over to our third panelist. So Professor Sarah Pepper, Sarah is co-director of the Centre for Creative Economy at Cardiff University, where she provides leadership and strategic direction to the centre and a number of projects, including Creative Cardiff, the Creative Industries Clusters Programme, R&D Cluster, and Media Cymru, a £50 million UKRI Strengthening Places funded programme. So Sarah, really interested to hear your thoughts on the presentation.
Diolch, Bernard and Prynhawn pawb. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for the invitation to join this very interesting event. A huge thanks here to Josh and colleagues at the Policy and Evidence Centre for putting together this piece of work and providing such a firm focus on the nations. I think it's very welcome. I've had conversations over a number of years with colleagues at the Policy and Evidence Centre, and there's a real will to dig into what our understanding is, not just of the wider sector, but how it works in different parts of the UK, where there is, a huge range. There are many differences. We've already heard from panel members in this session, about the importance of understanding that. So thanks for that care and consideration. It's a very important part of our dialogue going forward. I think a couple of the things that really stood out for me was the scale of the microclusters. 709 is significant. And I suppose within that, in the same way, my secondary point here was going to be about the scale of freelancers. I think both of those we're just starting to understand. And mapping is the first part of the picture, a very important part once we understand what that looks like. The next part of the question is then, well, what do we do to help and support and enable either the microclusters and likewise that wider freelance community? So I suppose one thing I'm looking forward to, out of the next part of the discussion around the findings in the report is, what we do next with the data and the evidence that surfaced. I think one thing that's important there, on both of those themes, and in fact, all the points previously made, is about granularity of place. And I think that's why I so warmly welcome this focus on nations and regions. I think we've been undertaking this work for nearly 10 years in the Centre for Creative Economy in Cardiff. And it never ceases to amaze me when I meet with colleagues that, we're already kind of, really divided in the way that our structures work and function. And whilst we're trying to join everything up, there are just many differences that we need to be really cognizant of and actually embrace and celebrate, because there's much that we can learn from really excellent practice in certain locations, within microclusters, within regions, within clusters, within nations. So I think, that focus on devolution and difference to learn from each other as much as, literally understanding that and explaining how it works. I think there were some excellent points made previously about policy landscapes and the pressure that they're under. I think it's also important to understand, what different policy levers and opportunities are located in those places. I remember talking to colleagues in England, talked about LEPs, and for a long time I just didn't really understand what they were because we don't have them in Wales. We have something quite different. So it's useful to share that and learn from each other. And I think, we can also learn a lot from each other about these mapping techniques that are so fundamental and important in terms of how we're talking to policymakers and to industry and to colleagues, about what's happening. I don't think we have got anywhere near close to understanding how we map freelancers in a really meaningful way, anywhere in the UK or anywhere globally. I think that's a really exciting next part of activity. And actually, that will then, I think, create varied maps in terms of sizes and scale. I know a lot of the data in this report is from public sector statistics. We look also into Companies House and other kind of data sources. Freelancers, then some of them will miss both of those sources. So we all have much to do together to learn about how we can do that all better. But, I just want to circle back and thank Josh and the Policy and Evidence Centre for putting this focus on, carefully thinking about the nations, about differences, similarities, and what we can all do to tell this story better in the future.
Thanks so much, Sarah. And I think I saw Josh nodding vigorously at the point on freelancers as well. So I think, that's definitely something that I suspect will kind of come out in wider Q&A too. Brilliant. So our final panelist is Dr. Jen Barley. So Jen is Head of Design Research at V&A Dundee, which is Scotland's first design museum. She's passionate about the role and responsibilities of design professionals, and through her work explores the value that design can add to our everyday lives. She's also been involved in a number of clusters programs herself, and also in national design policy work as well. So Jen, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Bernard, and thank you so much for the opportunity to be here today. At V&A Dundee, we use design to spark joy through creativity, and we advocate very much for the power of design as both extraordinary but also brilliantly ordinary. Examples link up to partnering on 2 AHRC projects, one in-game, a creative cluster in Dundee around video games, which is just ending, and another Design Hopes, just starting, part of the Future Observatory, focusing on NHS Scotland. So 2 diverse areas, but both focused on using design as an engine to grow the creative economy. Quickly, a very quick overview of some independent research we've recently commissioned, Design for Scotland, which was funded by Creative Scotland and led independently by Graft, a design agency in Edinburgh, in consortium with How to Glue and Studio Then. And they've adopted this really broad perspective by asking not what Scotland can do for design, but what design can do for Scotland. And this work's been underpinned by a working group of 36 professionals across the sector, but the project's also been costed in to cover freelancer time, to buy them out, to enable them to engage, which has been a really important part for us, and we hope to do that moving forward as it grows. Delving into that research, climate change and social inequality has very much been at the forefront, questioning the role of the design sector in Scotland, what makes it unique, but also where it falls short, and exploring the roots of design in unexpected places like non-design organisations, seeking opportunities to break down barriers and really enhance our understanding. And our focus is also extended on the local to the national, but encompassing government, but also looking at existing business economic support ecosystems across the country. But our curiosity doesn't stop in Scotland. We aim to really, and have broadened this scope to investigate design policies and strategies globally, questioning their efficacy, but also searching for inspiration and lessons that could be applied back home. So this 5-year plan led by the PEC, looking at these reports and building on it, is something that we'd really like to draw in to support that moving forward. And crucially, we're probing the tension and the relationship between design thinking and policy making. So to just wrap up, next steps for us very much include looking at design value enabling programmes, but building on 4 critical value domains, drawing inspiration from the UK Design Council's design value framework. So looking at social, planet, democratic and financial. And these are very much going to be our North Star for future endeavours. Thanks, Bernard.
Amazing. Thanks so much, Jen. And I think that that Design for Scotland project is a really fascinating example of bringing creative methods to engage places in shaping creative industries policy as well. And I think that's something that I think creative practice can definitely offer to this space, engaging communities in the design of that work as well. So we're going to open up to audience Q&A in a moment, but I just want to start off with a kind of couple initial questions based on what we've heard. And I think it's fair to say that I think one of the themes that kind of came up across the comments was around, microclusters, so recognizing those as real growth hotspots, both within kind of wider kind of clusters or big creative cities, but also across other parts of the country. But also, I think, recognizing that there's some real challenges in terms of funding at a kind of local council level to support that kind of geographic scale. And Lauren, I was really interested in the point that you made, which is that councils aren't simply funders, they're also place shapers and active contributors to creating those wider environments. And I was interested to get your sense of, what are the other strategies that local policymakers can use to support microclusters in their areas? Where should local councils start?
Thanks, Bernard. And actually, I noticed that we've got Patrick from the Audience Agency in the Q&A here. So it's very timely because Patrick actually authored our report along with his colleague Richard on Creative Places, which is a toolkit that we published that sort of sets out some of the ways that local authorities can support the creative economy. I think from my perspective, there are a few areas. Firstly, there's definitely something around leadership, political vision, and sort of vision really at an officer and a political level. As Simon was saying earlier, in Bradford, for example, you had real political leadership from Councillor Hinchcliffe and the Chief Exec Kirsten England there in sort of promoting that city of culture model, and you can really see that you know, it's helpful in setting out a priority for an area and sort of saying, yeah, we're open for business. I think there's also something around mapping, around understanding the local economy, around understanding the cultural infrastructure in a place, and using that to set strategy. We've seen in places like Coventry where they've published a sort of place profiler, but not everywhere has resources to do that kind of activity. So I think sort of work like this that the Creative PEC is producing, and the idea of that mapping tool is going to be really, really valuable to lots and lots of local authorities. There's also something around those policy levers that Sarah was mentioning earlier, and policy alignment. So, you know, councils have a key role to play in all sorts of other policy areas around things like planning, licensing, regeneration, education, skills, and I think, you know, the real powerful role that local authorities can play is joining up those policy agendas in convening partnerships that bring those people together, along with, for example, higher education institutions who play such a key role in this space. And we know we've seen that, as I think, for example, I became aware of earlier this week of something that Kent County Council and the Thames Estuary Partnership have published, which is a kind of planning for culture toolkit, which I think is a really good example of those partners across a spatial area working together to embed culture in wider policy areas. And then I think finally there's something about connection with the community, which relates to that point around EDI, around access to cultural service, around access to jobs and roles in the creative industries, and there's a sort of the council place shaping role can be really vital there in sort of widening access. We've seen through things like the business and IP centres in libraries, the British Library Initiative, which, you know, plays a really, really powerful role in opening up access to a wider range of different communities to business support and to skills training, this sort of sector. And you know, in the Commission on Culture and Local Government that I spoke about earlier, we had a section of recommendations on this with a strong focus on things like the 7 inclusive principles, which I think again can be set a really useful framework for thinking about some of these areas.
Thank you, Lauren. I think that one of the kind of themes that really came out in there is, you know, that kind of important role of kind of relationship building, network building, and also negotiation. And I think this is so often a really hidden and under-resourced aspect of work. And Sarah, I mean, I know that you've been doing this at kind of multiple sort of policy scales, you know, bringing in sort of national funding with kind of local government organisation and coordinating across those different scales of government. And it's interesting if you could say a little bit more about, you know, what it means to kind of take that kind of ecosystem approach to cluster support. You know, what are some of the lessons that you've learned?
That's a great question, Bernard, and I think it's right at the heart of the work that we all do, and that's really digging in and knowing our places. It has to start, you know, from a very localized point. And I guess, yeah, 10 years ago when we started that here in Cardiff, we literally started mapping what was on our doorstep. And that's why when I was talking about, you know, that granular work and you know, really focusing on your own place being vital. I mean, we built first Creative Cardiff, which is a network, I guess, a way to connect and visualize and see and understand and encourage collaboration. We've got touch points now with some 6,000-7,000 creative individuals and organizations. That's sort of growing out into the city region. The next thing that came for us was one of the creative industries cluster programs. We were so fortunate in being supported through one of the 9 clusters to then encourage innovation work. So once we knew what was there, we then built out into that kind of cluster and wider kind of innovation and growth idea. And then we took that on through the Strength in Places bid to scale that work, and particularly the screen industries, which is a strength of place. And I mean, I saw a couple of questions in the chat and specificity in clusters and places. I think that's really important. The micro clusters will do some of that work. That's really vital, understanding those strengths, particularly then when you scale. I mean, one of the pieces of work we've been doing in the last couple of years is that kind of, I guess, part of the creative corridors, if you like, supercluster work, whichever terminology you want to use to describe it, of partnering with colleagues in Bristol and Bath and looking at what that region is. So we haven't published it yet, but we've been doing some work that identifies what those sector strengths are in those locations, to see how they join up and see how they extend. And then likewise, ourselves and Bristol and many others also have that international strategy. So it's a multi-layered, continually evolving picture. But I think going back to your original point, Bernard, it's really resource intensive. I mean, we're doing that because we're a university and we're interested in it from an academic perspective, but also because we run a number of these big programs where we partner with stakeholders, other universities in the region, government partners on all levels, local authority, regional government, national government in Wales and UK government. So it's a big job of work to do really well, which is why I think at every given cost we have to share with others across the UK where we're learning to do any of this with any particular level of success or opportunity, because it does take a significant amount of resource.
That's great. And I think that thing around, yes, as you said, like how do you kind of open source those great ideas and share learning across places, I think is really key. And you know, I think this kind of segues actually quite nicely into some of the kind of questions that are coming in from the audience. So I'd love to bring some of those in. So I've got here a question from Grain Hitchin. So the corridors identified are pretty well-known industrial and innovation regions. Is there any evidence that there are distinctive creative industries clustering in those locations? So maybe I could hand that one first to Josh, but then others on the panel, please do chip in.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks, Graham. I think that's a really good point. I mean, I think, you know, there's a question of to what extent what we're seeing here as corridors is a phenomenon of places that are built up and economically kind of developed otherwise, or whether there are particular specializations. And at least in this particular methodology, this is showing where there are particular specializations in creative industries as opposed to other sectors. But that doesn't mean that there aren't also other high value sectors that are going on there, or particularly innovative sectors. And so I think one of the things that I think is in the back of my mind in terms of thinking about how we position this work going forward is there's an important question, I think, in terms of thinking creative industries and also sort of relatedly the issues of culture and cultural funding and things like this, and how they relate to other high value sectors as well, how they relate to innovation specifically and the relationship for these. And then also I think there's also this question thinking about corridors is how we strengthen links between clusters, but then how we also bring the benefits of those clusters further out into more either rural areas or places that are not as immediately linked up there. And I think that's kind of an interesting but related question that ties into some of the work that we've done looking at creative industries and sort of microclustering in rural places and trying to actually square the circle a little bit in that to try to find ways to build those linkages whilst also strengthening within clusters as well.
Great, thanks so much, Josh. So you kind of touched on corridors and kind of another question on that topic. So this one's from Jenny Jordan. So the potential of corridors is a fascinating insight of the research. I'd be interested to learn what the mechanisms are that underpin the links. It looks like they follow transport links, perhaps making it easier for freelance workers to work across different microclusters. So Josh, I know you'll have some thoughts on this, but Saima, I know that you mentioned in your remarks you know, some of the specific infrastructural challenges that you see in the north, for example, around sort of transport. Maybe before we hand over to Josh, I'd be interested in your thoughts on, you know, what are some of the key kind of infrastructure ingredients that you think we might be needing to think about for the creative industry to support that kind of corridor growth?
Thank you. I think sadly the ones that the government needs to sort out. I think, you know, I was talking about transport because I think it's really key. You know, we've been talking about the freelance infrastructure. We've been talking about, you know, how do we string different areas together. And if I talk about the North specifically, it can take as long to get from, you know, Bradford to Manchester as can get from, you know, Leeds to London. And, you know, that kind of connectivity is really hampers things. And I think if we actually want to be able to move forward effectively and efficiently, both in terms of actually stringing companies together and creating that access to the collaboration, but also actually in terms of labour markets and freelancers. It's very difficult to freelance when you're, obviously, we've got the whole digital infrastructure, but it's very difficult if you need to be able to get to things quickly. And, it's all about the kind of sector that you're in. So I think those things can really, really hamper. And then I think there is the other side of things in terms of that connectivity between the North and the South. We're talking about creating the clusters, but actually the clusters need to be able to connect across the country as well. And I think what we are seeing, especially with the rail infrastructure, those things can be really, really difficult, and they actually create delays. And I think especially when you're smaller businesses or you're a freelancer and you're less able to sustain the kind of shocks and the delays that those things can create to your business, it becomes really, really difficult. So I think, and the reason I'm saying it's probably, it's a big UK-wide and governmental question, is that actually if we are wanting to move forward effectively, both in terms of the creative industries, but actually as industry as a whole, and to be able to compete effectively internationally and work together effectively nationally, those are the key things that we need to address. Because again, if we look at something like the North, which is just, it's a massive region, lots of rurality. Start dropping away the bus services, the train services, all of those things, unless again, you're at that level where you're able to afford to get around. It just becomes very difficult.
That's really helpful, thank you. And in the interest of time, I'm going to try and ask a couple more audience questions before we have to wrap up. So this is a question on sort of place-based funding from Jason. So place-based funding and policy initiatives increasingly focus on smaller geographies. Available data invariably doesn't. Creative microclusters work can really help address this. But the questions are, first of all, like how can we push governments, etc., to make data more available at smaller geographic levels? How can we ensure that inevitably smaller sample sizes and data will be robust enough to meaningfully inform policy interventions in smaller towns? So Josh, I don't know, maybe if this is one that you have any thoughts on.
Yeah, I think, this is a crucial issue. We need to find ways of making sure that data is available to policymakers across the board, particularly in local areas, and particularly in those places, as Jason says in his message, that are smaller. And I think that in some cases, I think there's good and improving data availability coming down the line, but I think but at the same time, it is a challenge. There's a huge issue. There's a lot of interest, for instance, in gross value added as a measure for economic impact of creative industries. But the data that is collected by the ONS through no fault of their own makes it very, very difficult to make actual robust estimates of that at a local level. We can only do that with regions and sort of try to gross that down to local areas, which is not completely, it's estimates. And so I think, there are things we can do with the data we have. I think there's also a need to use new data sources that are available as proxies, and there's a scope, I think, in this for trying to look at more at kind of experimental data sets and realizing what we have and saying this is as good as we have for now, and hoping that the direction of travel will see more and better data becoming available, and lobbying for that at all levels.
Great, thank you so much, Josh. And I think that's really sort of an aspiration that we have for our future State of the Nations work as well. And I'm mindful that we're coming up to 1 o'clock, so possibly the end or the beginning of people's lunch breaks. I know there's a huge number of questions that we haven't had a chance to answer yet. And just to kind of stress that within the PEC, what we will try and do is to kind of answer where we can and reflect on some of the questions that you've really helpfully shared. I think there's a huge wealth of material here, both for this kind of audience and also for future research work as well. So I think it only is left for us to kind of wrap up the events. So first of all, I'd like to just say a massive thank you to our panelists and speakers for so thoughtfully sharing their insights on this topic. A massive thanks to all of you for tuning in today and contributing to the conversation with your kind of questions, thoughts and comments. Just in terms of some kind of last housekeeping, In terms of closing up, we're going to be circulating a link to the full report to all attendees after the event. Please do also, if you haven't done already, sign up to the Creative PEC's newsletter. It's a great way to stay informed on upcoming research and events that we're doing. And then lastly, just to say, our next State of the Nations report is going to be launched in March, focusing on our internationalisation theme with a focus on international trade as well. So do stay tuned for that. But just to say again, a massive thank you all for joining, and we look forward to continuing the conversation.